Good morning. Welcome to the Boardwalk Talks program of the Dauphin Island Sea Lab Aquarium. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the Sea Lab. And we are here this morning with Dr. Sean Wang and Dr. Jeff Krause. And they're going to chat with us this morning about the creation of marine sediments and the role that marine clays may play in climate change. This is some new research that these two have collaborated on. And so with that, I am going to let Dr. Wang tell us a little bit about his part in this research.
Okay. So our project is about reverse weathering. Study the factors that control the rate of reverse weathering. Does it work? All right. So, but before we go into reverse weathering, let's briefly introduce the normal weathering. Weathering is very important for us because it's a process that happens near the surface of Earth, and the nutrients in rivers and seawater comes from weathering. So the organisms in the ocean need these nutrients that come from weathering. Okay. And weathering on land has two parts. The first part is physical weathering that breaks rocks into small pieces, like wind. You can see this in some of the tourist sites, as well as the roots of plant and the ice forming and melting. They crack the rocks into small pieces. Then the chemical weathering kicks in that dissolves the small pieces of rock into dissolved ions. The second important role that weathering plays is it regulates the temperature on Earth. It sort of works as a thermostat that keeps the temperature of Earth under control. So if the CO2 in the atmosphere increases, and the temperature will go up, and then the reactions between rainwater, which contains dissolved carbon dioxide, with rocks, the rate of reaction will increase, and this will further draw down the CO2 and keeping the temperature stable. On the other hand, if the CO2 drops, the temperature will drop and the reaction will slow down, and this will allow the CO2 to build up again. So this will prevent the Earth from freezing up. So this is how Earth's temperature has maintained in a comfortable range so that life can evolve from very basic level to the complex level we see today throughout the 4.567 billion years history. I think that's the normal weathering. Until recently, the reverse direction of the weathering, which is called the reverse weathering, has been overlooked. And that is also playing important roles in controlling the temperature on the surface of Earth. And I'll leave that to Jeff to talk about reverse weathering.
Excellent.
Yep.
All right, thank you. So reverse weathering is funny because it sounds like it's the absolute opposite of chemical weathering, but strictly speaking, the reactions aren't quite exactly balanced. So what happens in reverse weathering, if you want to come in closely, is organisms that are studied in my lab are called diatoms, and they are photosynthetic, but when they die, they have a shell that's made of silicon that just sits in the sediments. So we have some diatoms here. They're microscopic, so these are billions and billions of diatoms that are freeze-dried. And when they settle down to the sediments, what's intriguing is something happens with that shell. And when you take that shell and you add some materials that are already in the sediments, such as degraded clay, iron oxide, which we know as rust, bicarbonate, which you might know as baking soda, and then organic matter, for instance, the organic matter associated with the phytoplankton themselves, we actually create new clays that coat the shells. So this is an image kind of before and after from a collaborator on this project, Dr. Wang and I have. Her name is Dr. Tang, and she's at Georgia Tech. And these are diatoms that have been coated with this new clay material. Now what's important about this is the coatings take all these components and they put them in the coatings, but the byproduct is CO2, which works against what chemical weathering does. And so the formation of these clays around diatoms and other hard parts with silica actually result in the formation of CO2 in marine sediments.
Jeff, the shell part of the silicon part of the diatom is sort of like glass, so it's very resistant to that chemical weathering, right?
The glass shell is, when it's in the water, it's coated by organic matter because when the shell is exposed to seawater, it wants to dissolve. But it's also dense. It's more dense than water, and because of that, it will sink. And so once it's in the sediments, when that organic matter is stripped by bacteria, because the bacteria want to use the organic matter as a food source, then it exposes the silica to the seawater, and these chemical reactions can occur. The clays that we normally think about, you might think about more marine sediment looking, this is a kind of a cake of marine sediment it's been settled and sat in a bucket for many years. Reference clays are used all over the world, because clays are very important to industrial applications. And one of the reasons why this is a tough subject and why this really wasn't known is because all this clay that comes from terrestrial environments is a really big signal that is tough to filter out when you're looking for these tiny clays that are forming in the marine sediments themselves. So here are some pictures. These are actually from sediments in Mississippi Sound. They're highly magnified. This is 10 micrometers, the scale length, and that would 100 of these scales would be equal to 1 millimeter. So this is exceptionally tiny. And you can see this diatom shell. It's really intricate and beautiful, but you see this material that's sitting around it. This is new clay. This is new material that's formed. Here's another diatom, also from the same region, and you can see all these precipitates that are occurring on here. And precipitates are scientific for kind of new solids that are formed from solution. If we scoot down a little bit, you can see some of the first evidence of this was actually published 20 years ago. You can see how this diatom can be transformed into this kind of massive clay goo. It's tough to actually figure out what this would be if you didn't have laboratory information to tell. And actually, the laboratory that Dr. Wang came out of at Yale took this type of information and they applied it to a model to see what the regulation is of this process on global climate. So Dr. Wang talked about how CO2 is really important because it keeps the Earth not only warm, but warm enough for humans and animals to live. So what they did is they asked what happens to not only the pH of the ocean water, but atmospheric CO2 when you don't have reverse weathering, this extra CO2 source from the sediments as a buffer. And you see that the red line shows this kind of odd oscillation over geologic time. But when you do have this as a buffer, it allows the atmospheric concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to not be as variable. And the same thing with marine pH. It keeps marine pH at a fairly constant level. This is, again, a modeling study, and there's a lot of assumptions to that. And as Dr. Wang and I are doing right now is we're trying to understand the processes that are causing this rate to happen, and basically what are the ingredients that you need for these minerals to be formed. What we're doing is we're actually doing not only laboratory work in collaboration with with Dr. Tang at Georgia Tech, but we're going to go out to the field in the Mississippi River Plume area, which is, here's the Birdfoot Delta, here's Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and we're going to go out on this vessel, which is called the research vessel Pelican, and we are going to go and take some sediment samples, and we're going to start collecting sediment, and we're going to run experiments in the laboratory. In terms of collecting sediment, there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. We're going to use what's called a multi-core, but if we brought that multi-core in here, we couldn't fit it through the door. It's so large. So Dr. Wang has brought a sediment grab from the Dauphin Island Sea Lab technician support. And these grabs basically get surface sediment. It looks like a big scoop, and that's exactly what it does. So you can put this, right now it's engaged so it doesn't move, but if you pull out the trigger, the key, it's now engaged. And when you take this down to the sediments and then you pull up, it's get a scoop, it keeps everything in. You can bring this up to the surface, and then when you're done, you can grab the sediment outside of it. So that's one of the types of technology which is pretty simple that we use to get sediments from the seafloor. And this is challenging when you're on a boat that sits 150 to 200 feet above the seafloor. So you have to have instruments to go down and get it. But when we get back to the lab, as I say, we're going to be running experiments, and then we're going to be analyzing the samples in a special way. And so Dr. Wang, I want to have him talk to you about some of the technology that we're using to analyze these samples.
And so while y'all swap the microphones, I think something that's interesting to mention about our sediment grabs is that sediment grabs differently whether it's sand or mud, and what y'all use to sample that. So the sediment core, doesn't that tend to get more of a variability within the sediment column than a sediment grab would?
Absolutely. A sediment grab like this is designed to grab sediments from the surface. However, with a core, you can go down into the sediments deeper. And some of the deepest cores they can core kilometers into the deep sea through a program called the Ocean Drilling Program, which is an international program. And you've worked with the drilling program, correct?
Yeah. Some of our marine cores, some of them are drilled on the continent. So the longest core can be up to more than 10,000 kilometers, 10,000 meters. Yeah.
So how deep a core will you be taking for this project?
For this project, because we are interested primarily in the river plume sediments, the deepest we'd probably go is 50 meters, so about 150 feet.
Wow.
That's thousands of years accumulation, right? Even more.
And with those thousands of years, it's stacked. So
Yes.
It's almost like if you were to look at rock on land.
Yes.
That has those lines. That
right.
sediment has that line as well.
Yeah. We sedimentary geochemists read the sediments layers as books. So you read it page by page. The oldest is at the bottom.
So just like, could you describe the process practically, visually, so that people could understand, like, how the diameter of the core, maybe indicate, the size of the core, and then what happens after it's pulled up and extruded? And
yeah, I think the diameter core is about a few inches, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just
it's a cylinder, a few inches, and then we cut them into pieces and then analyze them.
We have some videos of that from some of the other labs that do core work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So as Jeff said, we were going to analyze the sediments once they are dug up from the seafloor. But the sediment is a mixture of a lot of components. Some of them are formed by the reverse weathering in the water, and some of them are actually derived or inherited from the parent rocks on land. So it's very complicated. And as you can see here on the surface of these grains, you can see some of the components formed inside the water, but the center big pieces are actually derived from the continents. So they're not formed by reverse weathering. So we have to separate out them and measure their signals. And physically separating them out is almost impossible. So we have to rely on some kind of chemical treatment that can selectively dissolve the part that is formed underwater.
So is this from a core?
This is from an image from a paper. It's 100 micrometer. It's not from our core, but our core will look like similar.
Okay.
Right.
So would this be a cross section of the core?
Yeah, this is a thin section. So we cut the rocks into very thin, less than 1 millimeter thick, and then look them under microscope, and you can see this kind of images. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, chemical selective dissolution of only the part we want is tricky. We have to prove that we're not dissolving the inherited rocks that we don't want. So we have to find some kind of chemical indices that can tell if we have contamination or not. And the tools we're going to use is silicon isotopes and lithium isotopes.
So the inherited rock would be that which is not formed by the reverse weathering.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And we want to prove that we do not dissolve that part using metals and isotopes.
Because you're specifically wanting to analyze the reverse
weathering product.
Rocks that are
yes, correct. So an isotope is essentially an atom. An atom is composed of like outer shell with electrons, and the inner core with smaller particles like protons and neutrons. And isotopes of the same element are basically atoms with different number of neutrons. So we can think of them as different members of the same family. They have the same last name but different given names. And the relative numbers of different isotopes can tell you a lot of signals about the processes happening on Earth. So the relative numbers of isotopes were basically determined at the start of the universe, when the Earth was formed, when the universe was formed. For example, silicon was dominated by the silicon-28 with a very small amount of 29 and 30. And lithium is dominated by 7 and very little amount of lithium-6. So, however, there are small variations in the relative proportions of different isotopes, and that's the key we want to look at because they will tell us the sources of the materials. And to measure the small variations of these proportions is not easy, so we have to use a very high precision instrument. We will use an instrument called a multi-collector mass spectrometer housed at DISL, and this machine is called the Neptune. Currently there's only one such instrument in Alabama, and so we're very excited to get some data out of it.
So very quickly, just as a note of interest, the Sea Lab in September, we did have some impacts from Hurricane Sally.
Mm-hmm.
And so this instrument, the only one that's in Alabama, is housed in one of our buildings that was impacted. So as I understand it, you came down right after the hurricane to check on the status of your lab. Can you give us just like a brief update on what happened?
Yeah, it was risky to have such a big instrument located in the hurricane zone. But last year and this year, we were lucky enough to not have a water damage on the instrument yet. So we have to think about the long-term way to protect it.
So your lab was okay after
It's fine, yeah.
Sally. However, Dr. Krause's lab had some.
I had an unplanned skylight. The air conditioner was knocked over by the wind to the one-ton unit, and I could see the sky from my lab, and the resulting water damage was significant. But we're almost back up and running. The maintenance crew around Dauphin Island Sea Lab, they've cleaned it up. The contractors have reworked our ductwork, and our fume hood's back on. So we're now just cleaning the lab, and we're hopefully going to be back running samples next week or the week after.
Yeah.
One of the additional challenges doing marine science.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So Sean, what's really interesting is explain how the mass spectrometer works.
Oh yeah, sure. It looks like a big machine that occupy a regular room. You need a regular room to host it. It's a big machine, but thousands of words are needed to describe it fully. But I'll try to compress it into a few sentences. But basically, what it does is, so we purify the silicon and lithium, and then send them into a plasma, which is the same as the lightning spark we see during a thunderstorm. So this plasma is at a very high temperature, like 8,000 degrees, basically the same temperature as the surface of the sun. This plasma will knock off the electrons from the atoms and make these atoms, silicon atoms and lithium atoms, charged. And then we accelerate these charged ions with a very high voltage, electrical voltage, 10,000 volt, to very high speed. And the high speed ions will be separated by this magnet. It's a very strong magnet. It weighs about 1,000 pounds. So the ions will be separated out into different beams as different isotopes. And then we basically count the number of atoms using this multi-collector array. So it's amazing to think about it. Such a big machine, what it does is actually to count these tiny atoms.
So can you go back to the picture that you showed that was the section of the sediment?
Which one?
And so can you explain what does that tell you about this?
Because the detrite, we call it this detrital, the part that comes from the continents has different lithium isotopic compositions and silicon isotope compositions from the part that is formed by reverse weathering. So we can look at the isotopic signatures. These serve as a sort of fingerprints that can tell you where stuff are coming from.
Why is it different? Why is the mineral composition different?
It's the processes that control the isotopic fractionations. See, those are big brothers and smaller brothers. This is heavy, we call it, because it has more neutrons. So during a chemical reaction, going from reactant to product, the lighter, the smaller guys will run faster. So they will be enriched in the product.
So why are those minerals, why are they present in the continental sediments, and different minerals are present in the marine, contribution to this?
So the rocks on land actually come from volcanisms. They are, we call it igneous rocks. They were formed under high temperatures. Those environments will cause different minerals to form. While in the marine, Jeff can tell you more, it's all involves water. That when water comes into play, you have different minerals.
It's also,
Give him the mic.
yeah.
Okay, can you pick it up? Got it.
So beyond water, it's low temperature. So as Sean just mentioned, volcanism, it's exceptionally high temperature. And so the processes and the way that minerals are formed in seawater, well, they're formed in a temperature range that's going to be, the deep ocean is about freezing, and the warmest waters in the ocean can be maybe 35 degrees centigrade. So it's a relatively narrow range of temperatures. And then you also have to think about the pressure of the ocean, the salinity of the water, and all the chemicals that are dissolved in it. All those things matter. And those are different from processes in land. And so that's one of the reasons why those subtle differences give us kind of a little way to make separations. But we're looking for small signals, which is why we need instrumentation and methods that allow us to amplify those small signals so we can have confidence in our results.
So we do have a question from Blair, which I'll need you to pull up.
Okay.
Has the reverse weathering process stayed relatively constant over geologic time, or has the rate of these processes varied, I think is the full question.
You want to answer this?
Sure.
Okay. Some of the models showing that it was more important in geologic time. Right now, the rate is still relatively unconstrained. And when we say unconstrained, that means we don't have a great idea of what the global rate is right now, and we need more research on it. In terms of a magnitude of how much, I study the element silicon, and the amount of silicon that is bound up by this process is equivalent to about what the rivers pour into the ocean annually. So it's a big number. And there's a lot, if you think about all the mud and all the dirt and all the sediment that's going into to rivers like the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the great rivers in Southeast Asia, all that is just loaded with silicon. And this process alone globally is about that same magnitude. And how that changes over geologic time, it feeds back with processes like chemical weathering that Dr. Wang was talking about.
Yeah. Which definitely changed. Although we have uncertainty on the exact number of rates, but we do know they changed a lot over geological history, at least in terms of weathering, because Earth has went from freezing, we call it a snowball Earth, where the Earth was covered by ice entirely. So which means very low temperature, very low weathering rate. So weathering rate on land actually provides a substrate material for reverse weathering. If the weathering rate on land changes, the reverse weathering in the ocean will change as a result.
So could you almost compare the weathering rate on land to the weathering rate like in a rock to a sediment core? Can you find some comparisons between the two?
In terms of the weathering rate?
Yes, in terms of where they happen. So like if it slowed on Earth, you saying it's just going to show in the core of the sediment as well, correct?
So can you look at a core and identify the rate of weathering for a particular point of time? Is that what you...
Yeah, for weathering on land we have different indexes. Lithium isotopes is one that can tell you the relative weathering intensity on land. So you can construct a weathering intensity history from a core, and you can see these wiggles of lines, indicating the intensity, relative intensity. The exact number is hard to constrain.
What in the core tells you, gives you a timeline, so an amount of time that has passed?
We have different methods to determine the age of the rocks. And radiogenic isotope is the one. It's a clock that can tell you when the rock was formed. At least during volcanisms. In terms of sediments, determining the age of the sediments is more complicated, but there is a way to do that.
So you can take certain parts of the core and create a timeline for the age of the sediments, and then you can see how much of that core there is between these different time points.
Right.
And that would tell you how much weathering is occurring between these different time points.
Yeah. That's an easy way to think about it.
And I think what would be interesting to mention, so Dr. Wang, you work a great deal with the rocks, but understanding diatoms and that they do sink and their silica sinks and comes detritus, so that's what the sediment is made up of.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting to have you two working together on something of this nature to figure out how CO2 and the weathering and all of it works together.
Let's just re-emphasize what diatoms are.
Yes, diatoms are single-cell plankton. They are photosynthetic, so they're like land plants, but they're microscopic. So a land plant, like a tree, is leaves, its stem, its root structure, and they use all of those different components to do photosynthesis, and which makes their food. Phytoplankton, which a diatom is a type of phytoplankton, they do all of that with one cell. And globally, diatoms give us as much oxygen, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis. The diatom contribution is similar to all the rainforests combined. And the ocean and the land plants, so the plankton in the ocean and the land plants on land, give us about equal amounts of oxygen globally. What's intriguing is I study the shell of the diatom, and this is where interdisciplinary collaboration comes in. I have never taken a course called geology. I took geological oceanography when I was in graduate school, but I've never taken a geology course. This gentleman, that's his expertise. And so us coming together, we're able to answer questions together that neither one of us can answer alone. And this work is funded by the National Science Foundation Chemical Oceanography and co-funded by National Science Foundation Geological Oceanography. So it's exciting to me to be able to, have a geologic project because that was never anything that I went to school for, and I've learned this, and I've been able to do this type of work because of experts like Sean and our collaborator in Georgia Tech.
So I know that you're focusing on diatoms, but there are other planktonic organisms with different mineral compositions.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment briefly on how they might be significant to this process?
So there are other groups that use silica. They are also planktonic. They can be single cells called radiolera or phaedaria. They're actually more similar to us in their cell structure than they are to diatoms. They're eukaryotes. They're heterotrophic eukaryotes, meaning they eat their own food instead of create it. There's a lot of other plankton that use calcium carbonate to make their shells. And those processes are very different because of the way calcium carbonate behaves at high pressure. And so these types of processes that we're looking at them specifically for anything that creates silica. And so I'm not as familiar with the kind of calcium carbonate sediment literature, but you might have a comment on that. Foraminifera. But some of the processes involved.
Okay, we have a question. Everyone wants to plant, this is from Cassie, to plant trees to combat climate change. How would you suggest increasing awareness on the power of phytoplanktonic communities and geologic processes being just as, if not more important?
Ooh. That's a tough question because it takes some effort and education to access this type of information. The problem with phytoplankton and understanding what phytoplankton are is they're not as visible as trees. And typically we only understand phytoplankton when they do something bad or when they have negative effects. So when you see a red tide, you think, oh, it's a negative effect. But you don't necessarily hear how important they are to the ecosystem and honestly to geologic processes. So a lot of the oil deposits that we use for fossil fuels, they're not dinosaurs, they're not animals, they're mainly ancient plankton that have been compressed and transformed over geologic time. Plankton. So plankton are not only the base of the food chain in the ocean. They're not only the source of half the oxygen we breathe, but they're also the major component of fossil fuels that we use for energy. So their importance to how we as a society function is essential, and the importance of them in geologic history has been critical. Do you have any other?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
good.
So Brandy asks, can you recommend any books or papers for reading?
Ooh, books or papers on specifically reverse weathering. The articles have been only. This process has been a little bit contentious in the literature. It was proposed in the 1960s, but the first direct experiments offering the most proof were published in the 1990s. You think about particle physics. Albert Einstein, that was 100 years ago. These are things that we're just starting to figure out in the last 20 years. So there isn't a definitive work on reverse weathering. There are sections in many papers. Encyclopedia of Ocean Sciences has an article written by Xiangli Raman, and she is a postdoc at the University of Southern Mississippi, and her dissertation work at Stony Brook University was instrumental to put a number on that global rate of reverse weathering. In terms of chemical weathering, could you recommend some literature?
There are a lot of papers and books on chemical weathering. For the reverse weathering, there is the McKinsey paper was published earlier by some Yale faculty members. That was in the 1960s or 70s. Those are good to start with. In terms of chemical weathering, there are a lot. My familiar one is about isotopes. I would recommend DeLanger, Delanger, their papers on lithium isotopes, and that can give you a lot of references that you can track to learn more about the topic.
So this is this is something that is a newly developing understanding of this process and how it, what kind of a role it plays in climate change. Could you sort of recap what you sort of anticipate understanding from this project?
Go for it. You're the PI.
Okay. So we had a PhD student finish in June. She's now a postdoc at the University of Lund in Sweden, and her dissertation data showed us that these coatings that form around the diatom frustules, are what we call as shells, their isotope signature is significantly different from the diatoms themselves. And as Sean was mentioning, we need ways to extract these different components, and that isotope signal, it's large enough that when we extract it, we can see a difference. What we want to understand is does the magnitude of the difference change depending on what's there in the environment or depending on how it was formed. And so this is where our collaborator at Georgia Tech comes in. She is amazing at doing very controlled and detailed lab work under anoxic conditions. And anoxic means no oxygen. So that's challenging to do when we're breathing it everywhere. But she can run these experiments with her group. She can get the components of how this component makes maybe this product, and we're going to be able to start disentangling whether those different processes change the isotopic composition not only in silicon but in lithium, and that should give us some understanding and some context of what to look at when we're examining processes in the field. We got a lot more detail than that, but there's the Cliff's Notes version.
So you are doing the project in the Mississippi Sound, right?
Mississippi Delta, so right offshore Louisiana.
Okay. And would you expect to find significant differences depending on, say, whether you were looking in a delta where you have a lot of flow from the rivers that are pushing sediments from the land to the sea versus farther offshore or in the deep ocean?
What do you think?
And what factors, like temperature, like the sediments that are coming from land versus the sediment formation, that's from seafloor spreading or falling from the water column. So what kinds of factors would you expect to play a role in the differences you would see?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of factors. So Rebecca, who just graduated, we were working on the paper. She actually discovered that as we move away from the river plume from the Mississippi Delta, the reverse weathering rate actually changes systematically as we move away from the river plume. And that has something to do with the metal cations and the continental materials that serve as the raw material for the reverse weathering. So depending on the location, the cation concentration, how much inherited clays we have, at the latter location, the reverse weathering rate will respond. So we have reasons to hypothesize that the rates will change based on different locations.
So the significant factor there would be the source of the continental material, the sediments?
Yeah, how much suspended particles we have carried from rivers, from the continents.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's an important one.
And you had also mentioned temperature as being, a significant factor in weathering. And the deeper you go in the ocean, the lower the temperature. So
and more stable.
Uh-huh.
So
you experience less chemical weathering with the lower temperatures.
Yeah, that would be lower and stabler. But I would think reverse weathering mostly happen in shallow oceans where you have these cations from rivers and we'll call it altered clays, altered silicate minerals from the rivers. So as water moves away from the delta, the sediments precipitate out and settle into the sediments. And like in pelagic oceans, the reverse weathering should be lower than the location near the delta. Right.
Can you sort of describe again and sort of recap what reverse weathering is? So just sort of
maybe you just read on the board.
Re-emphasize what it is.
We can go to the board here. Ultimately, it's a process by which materials and sediments effectively recombine to form new coatings and clay material around some sort of a substrate made of silicons. And so in this case, a diatom shell is made of silica, and this is a necessary ingredient for all these things to form. And after the formation, one of the byproducts is CO2, which is why it's called reverse weathering, because chemical weathering consumes CO2. And so it's the balance of processes like these that help regulate CO2 in the atmosphere and ultimately our temperature as a planet.
And Cassie asks also, who prepared those beautiful diatoms?
Who prepared those two? These ones. CB. I'm not sure who CB is, but it's Cassie.
So do y'all have anything to add that we should be sure to take away from this?
Chemistry and geology matter, and they affect our lives. And as somebody who is trained as a biologist, I love that I can be interdisciplinary and I can look at how chemistry and biology interact over long time scales, and they do, and it matters to how the Earth functions.
So a lot of times these subjects are taught as if they are discrete topics, discrete areas of study, but there's a lot of interconnections between all of these processes.
Absolutely. None of this stuff happens in a vacuum. And so in sediments, we're talking about the geochemistry, but there are worms and worms and worms and worms and worms all over sediments on the ocean. And so how do those organisms affect these processes? There's lots of questions out there to be asked, and the interdisciplinary questions, the ones that blend expertise in biology, chemistry, geology, those are the ones that I find most interesting. And those are the ones that have been enabled by our collaboration.
Anything you'd like to add?
Oh, that's good.
Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for joining us for our Boardwalk Talk this morning.